Good morning, everyone. I'm Heather Phelps, and I'm the managing partner at Phelps. A warm welcome. We have several hundred distinguished leaders joining us today from across Canada and around the world. I will keep my remarks brief so that we can get to our panel discussion on what's next, the workplace of the future. Today's webinar came about as a result of two themes that emerged during recent client conversations. The first concerned forward planning. Many said, we know what we are doing to prepare for reboarding, but we are really curious what other organizations are up to. The second theme centered around a question we've all been asking ourselves. What will the new world of workplaces look like? Like many of you, we've been busy installing plexiglass barriers and reconfiguring our offices to make our employees feel comfortable and safe upon their return. But these new physical changes are just the beginning of the changes we will be seeing over the coming months. We framed our conversation today to begin with the now, discussing the most pressing challenges and critical lessons learned. We'll then move to the new, where our panel will share their thoughts on reimagining the workplace. Finally, we'll round things out by discussing how HR can continue to make significant contributions to help their organizations reopen safely and confidently. To help support our community of learning here at Phelps, we know that it's going to take the collective strength of us all to see this through. And that is why it's so important for us to take this moment now to share experiences and learn from each other. We've designed this interactive hour, and we invite you to post your questions in the question box. The webinar will be recorded and available to participants, so we certainly encourage you to share it with members of your team as you reimagine the workplace of the future. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to take a moment to thank them for participating today. We're thrilled that you are able to join us and share your experience and insights. If our meeting to prepare for this conversation was any indication, you're in for a treat today. From how learning and leadership will change to the impact of technology and generational issues, all of our panelists have deep insights and experience. On their own, these issues are complex. Put them all together, and we've got a massive opportunity to reimagine our workplaces in new and exciting ways. Let me begin by introducing Kerry Pond, CHRO with Trillium Health Partners. Kerry has been on the front line every step of the way through the pandemic, supporting HR for Credit Valley Hospital, Queensway Health Centre, and Mississauga Hospital. Before joining Trillium, Kerry was the Executive Director of HR for the City of Toronto, where he led many change initiatives. And prior to that, he was the Assistant Deputy Minister for the Centre of Leadership and Learning for the Ontario Public Service. A warm welcome, Kerry. Our next panelist is Mary Madigan-Lee, who has deep sector-wide HR expertise in leading complex business change and billion-dollar mergers with union and non-unionized settings. Mary has worked in healthcare, retail, and financial services, and she has just recently been elected as a board member for the HRPA. Great to have you with us, Mary. Next, let me introduce Simon Chan, VP of Talent, Academy, and Future of Work at Communitech, a private public innovation hub that supports a community of more than 1,500 companies, from startups to scale-ups to large global players. Simon is a thought leader and speaker on how communities can collaborate to future-proof their organizations, with 2 decades of diverse experience in enterprise and scaling organizations. Welcome, Simon. From a new learning perspective, we welcome Rashmi Swarup, the Vice President of Digital Learning with TVO. Rashmi is a transformative leader with a breadth and depth of local and global education. She's a TED-Ed innovative leader who connects with the virtual network of educators to motivate and empower students. Prior to her work at TVO, Rashmi was Superintendent of Education with the York Region District School Board. Welcome, Rashmi. Joining us with cross-border perspective, please welcome Kirk Webster, Director of Human Resources with Scepter, a 70-year-old design and manufacturing organization with offices in Canada and the US. Kirk has a strong background and experience supporting large, diverse workplaces of over 2,000 employees in multiple locations, including retail, manufacturing, and supply chain. Kirk is known for his best practices in successfully reimagining HR departments from the ground up into cost-efficient strategic entities. Welcome, Kirk. So what I'd like to do is start with our first opening shot question, and it's a question for our entire panel today. What would you say are the most critical lessons learned as a result of the pandemic? And I'd like to turn it over to whoever would like to start first.
I'll start. Lessons learned is that business continuity plans are really important. I think that in the past where you had a business continuity plan on a shelf that not a lot of people probably were looking at, it is critical. We will never go back to, I think, business continuity in the ways that we have done it before, would be one of my observations.
Thank you, Mary.
Yeah, and what I'd add is, one of the big lessons is watching organizations and how quickly they've had to make change when they've had no choice. And so I think one of the lessons is we've kind of, I think in the past, we've underestimated our ability to adapt and move quickly. And I think it's really important for us to find a way to maintain that nimbleness and that ability to actually move with speed and move with a sense of urgency. I don't think we want to lose that as we continue to move forward.
Very good point, Simon. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add in a couple of very high-level comments here, Heather. One is generally to expect the unexpected. We talk a lot about looking around corners and trying to anticipate and trying to refine exactly what's coming at us. And this has proven we may just not know the full extent of what's coming at us. And the second lesson from a leadership perspective is to practice self-care like never before, to preserve yourself, preserve your teams, and set the example, because we're in this for the long haul, if there's any indication.
Excellent point. Thank you, Kerry.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I mean, I think one of the things that we've seen is that flexibility is absolutely key, and actually working in a completely gray environment, that we can do that. Terrifying, certainly. Lots of gray hair, pulled out hair, business leaders wondering what are we going to do. But I think we've done a pretty good job, and that realization and understanding that we can operate on the fly without a plan or with minimal plans, and we look at it every day and we change every day. I think, to your point, Simon, we need to keep that going, because it's going to be critical. It was a nice surprise to find that we could actually do this. So I think that flexibility is going to be key going forward.
Absolutely.
I was reflecting on how advancements of medical science, and yet on the fragility of human life that this pandemic, showed us, and how that across the world, we still continue to be vulnerable even today and moving on, as some of you have mentioned. And from an organizational perspective, to think that how this low probability event had such a high impact. And what does it mean from a risk management perspective? So much to do, so much to plan ahead of time. Communication becomes so important, ongoing and timely, so that, the rumor mongering and the hearsay is not taken into account if organizations have that clear communication, whatever the communication may be.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rashmi. So let's start with a question around, from an HR perspective. I'd like to put my first question over to Kerry. Kerry, would you tell us, if you could comment on the impact that the pandemic has had on leadership and what this means for leaders as they move forward?
Sure, thanks, Heather. Well, I've given this some thought over the last few days as we prepped for the panel, and have a few reflections that I wanted to share. I want to thank you so much for being a part of this event today and part of this panel. I feel very honored to be sitting here with these esteemed leaders. So thank you very much, and happy Pride. Generally speaking, and in no particular order, this is a new sort of experience for everybody across the world. It's not really something anybody's gone through before in its full form. I talked a lot about this in the hospital with colleagues, and I had not been there beyond the last year and a half. And so for some, they mentioned SARS and other significant events, but to this level, we really hadn't experienced. So we're all going through it together, and that in and of itself is a really interesting experience, and can hopefully foster more collaboration than less. We've often talked about competencies of adaptability and agility over the years, and just how important they are. I think this experience has really kind of crystallized what that really means, and puts it right into action. It is no longer just a requirement. It is the new normal. It is exactly how we will need to operate, and I think it actually has changed thinking around leadership. We talk a lot about change and transformation, really important skills to have in leaders. My experience tells me that we're looking for leaders with those skills, but we're also looking for leaders who can find those skills and competencies in others and surround themselves with that expertise and that ability. In our world, in the hospital, this has come in the form of things like redeployment and moving staff very quickly into roles that they had never done before, and quite frankly, into roles that hadn't existed before, like screening at entrances to hospitals and to buildings. And so we've created workforces overnight. For our hospital, we hired on about 135 screeners, and that wasn't a business we ran before. And so for leaders to be thinking about new business, but also the prospect of losing and gaining teams really quickly, and how you have to react and lead in the moment, I think has brought a new reality to a lot of our leaders. And in particular, where you've had just literally no experience or insight or knowledge. We're also thinking, I think, in leadership, there are new ways that are coming up to motivate employees. And motivation has taken on new meaning, particularly in healthcare. We've got not only staff and leaders living in a little bit more fear out in the community when they walk through the doors of the hospital, but it's also increased the level of fear by the extended family, the extended friends. And we have to take that into account in terms of the impact that's not only having on the risk associated with the hospital and how, the risk to all of our organizations as everybody comes through those doors, but also about roles in the workplace, and just generally how that is impacting on ability to just keep up with pace, and ability to actually think about and support mental health. Work from home, as we talked about the other day, is not a new phenomenon for many of you, but it certainly is an interesting one for me as I came into healthcare. Generally, what I observed is a work from home conversation really was based in equity. We have a majority of our teams, our frontline teams, they have to be on site. They have to be providing care. We would all want that in our communities. And so the debate, from my limited perspective coming into healthcare, has really been one about equity. If we have frontline people who need to be here, we and the enabling or back office functions need to be there as well to support our colleagues. That conversation has really shifted more to risk, and actually lowering the risk of contact for people in the hospital, so that our front lines are protected as best we can. And so it's really been an interesting dynamic for leaders to absorb in this new world. And of course, cost and space considerations are now becoming even more urgent. So we're catching up to the conversations and to the work that's been happening across the world in terms of remote work. Last couple of things I'd say is leaders are experiencing this themselves. They're connecting to their own fears, to leadership and to their teams. And that has really, I think, caused leaders to rethink things like presence. How am I actually present with my teams? I'm doing that very differently now. I'm doing it through my own fear, but I'm also doing it remotely. I may be losing track of people. I may not be coaching and mentoring in the traditional form. Less personal connection. I'm not seeing body language. I'm not being able to observe people in action, those sorts of things. So it's really, right, kind of challenging leaders to rise up and think differently. And as I mentioned, last point would be really around resilience and self-care, and that's taking on even more importance. We need to preserve ourselves and our teams like never before, because this is not going away. And as much as things may have slowed down a little bit in the last few weeks, they certainly haven't slowed down when you think about specific areas like long-term care, where healthcare has really had to shore up and support our colleagues in long-term care, just as one example. So the preservation of our leadership and their ability to understand resilience and its importance has just taken on a whole new level. Those are just a few thoughts on leadership.
Excellent points, Kerry. Thank you very much. Does anyone else from our panel, would anyone else like to contribute any further comments?
I think I'll make a comment. So Kerry, it's really great. Healthcare it's really a paradigm shift, like you're saying, about people working from home. I get that. I do think as leaders, we do really have to do some self-reflection in terms of our own, how we are showing up and how we are nervous, and then trying to nurture and care for everybody else around. Like, when you get on an airplane and you have to put your mask on before you put a mask on a child, it's really, we do have to be well and check in with ourselves, and it's okay to feel stress and have a buddy system or people you can talk to allow yourself to be somewhat vulnerable. That way you'll be stronger in the end.
Thank you, Mary. Sorry, go ahead, Rashmi.
Sorry. I'd like to add that, when you talked about knowing your staff and the work from home, Kerry, it reminded me that it was such a reawakening that do we really know our staff? Because now that they work from home, you get to know different aspects of them and you understand them more as people than the title and the career and the professional skills they bring. And in a way, it helps us value them even more.
So
we
true.
literally have a new window into the world of our staff.
Into their animals, yeah,
for sure.
Absolutely.
The part I double click on from what Kerry said was just the mindset for leaders to think in a more temporary construct, right? We tend to think very much in like, we have to have set teams and our orgs have to be, extremely vertical and structured. I love the concept that you have there around just almost project-based work or team-based work, right? There's a book I read a while back called The Alliance. It was by, I think it was Reid Hoffman from one of the founders of LinkedIn. And he talked about that tour of duty concept. And I think that's really something we need to be thinking about, not for all of our teams, but when we're tackling unknown problems from a leadership perspective, we need to be thinking a little bit more flexibly around how do we create a SWAT team that goes and actually tackles a particular problem? How do we pull from across the organization to get that diversity of thinking and help people be able to do roles and pivot to roles that they may not have done before to solve a particular problem? It's great from a development standpoint and allows for that problem-solving mentality. So I love how that's the example that you provided from the hospital side of things.
Thank you, Simon.
And something I just wanted to add, I find it interesting as we talk about some of these qualities and those sorts of things. They're not really any different, if you think about it, than good leadership qualities have always been. They are. I mean, empathy, sympathy, understanding your teams, flexibility, all of those sorts of things have always made good leaders. So you know, while we're going through a very unprecedented time, I think you can probably look back and say, you know, the leadership type of skills we need have always been those same type of skills, right? And so, you know, some of the leaders that are good will be good in this because they were good before it. So it's interesting.
A great segue into our next question for Mary. Mary, I'd like you to kick this one off. It's from an HR perspective. What do you believe are the most pressing questions human resource leaders should be asking themselves now to support their organizations?
Yes, thanks Heather, and thanks everybody. When I was actually pondering what the questions are, there's just so many right now. But what I thought I would try to do is boil it down to kind of maybe a little bit more of a diagnostic. If I could have that little slide put up. So I created this, just a little placemat for everybody. You know, to Kerry and Simon's point about, you know, the way we're showing up is different now. It like, you know, where I was, we had a job jar. So people picked jobs that needed to be done, that might be right out of their comfort zone. And it was just work that needed to be done. So I think one of the big pressing questions is for us to be able to sort of step back and say, well, what is your new organizational narrative? I was chatting with a CEO of a large Canadian retailer, and we were talking about retail. And I said, you know, what is next? And he said, I actually don't know. But what I do know is that we actually have to figure out how to do this and remain nimble. So we are in a time of radical uncertainty. We don't know if people are going to actually have the willingness to distance, if we're going to have more outbreaks. We've got government and personal debt on the rise. So when I created this slide, it was kind of like just to try to elevate ourselves up a little and look at our total ecosystem that we're in now versus the ecosystem we were in before, and really trying to help ourselves define what it looks like from a large business perspective. So if you think of the circles, you know, your strategy is not the strategy that it was before, but what are some of the things that are part of your strategy that you know about now or don't know about? How is your operational excellence at this point? You know, things like supply chain have changed dramatically. Where are we going to put our efforts on innovation and new technology? Because we've leapfrogged 10 years, there's no going back. And is your risk tolerance, is it do you have a higher risk tolerance than you had before? Is it, you know, working with your boards in that? Are you actually demonstrating that we need to be showing more risk in order to be out ahead of the pack? Things like your leadership. Do you have the right leadership? To Kurt and Simon, Kerry, and Rashmi's points, leadership is still good leadership. What we need to really be assessing though is, you know, the kinds of skills that you have in leadership, are they the right alignment? Do you need more sales than you used to have? Do you need more technology leaders than you had before? The same qualities are needed in leaders. It's just where are we actually going to be positioning them? With diversity and inclusion, you know, Black Lives Matter, the BIPOC and LGBTQ, you know, it's not so much that there are programs and we tick the box, and I'm not being disrespectful. I think this has also leap forwarded so much in the last period of time. These things are going to be part of our fabric, and how are we going to do that as HR practitioners in everything that we're doing with our leaders? Another question I think that we already sort of talked about is, are you going to be vulnerable enough to not know all the answers? Like the CEO I was chatting with, is you have to be planning, you have to know your organizational narrative as it is right now, but there's so much that we don't know. If you think about, you know, what's going to happen in the aviation world, what's going to happen you know, as oil demand goes down, what's that going to do to our economy? But it's okay to not know. And it's okay to know some answers, I think, within that. And then sort of, I think one of my last questions is, how are you going to describe your new normal or abnormal or whatever it ends up being to all your stakeholders as you move forward? Now, the way I sort of put these on this chart, they can change based on, you know, what matters to you in the industry that you're in. I think it's really important that we pause for a moment as we go through all of this, because we are so much in reactive mode, which is really, really critical. We've been reacting, people working remotely, we've just been reacting around everything. It is maybe a time for us to take a bit of a pause, to stand back and take a bit of a higher level to really sort of say, what is new? What is new for us? And how are we going to move forward? So that's kind of where I wanted to answer. I don't think I put all the most important questions. I think a million important questions, but just wanted to kind of put it into one sort of frame that we might be able to, as leaders, bite off pieces as we go through.
Thank you, Mary. I was just speaking with a client just the other day who said that the new normal term that's being used, he said it's anything but normal. So it's certainly a challenging time right now because there isn't a normal. I'd like to turn over to our panel and just ask if there's any further contributions regarding that they'd like to add to Mary's comments.
Mary talked a lot about ecosystems and looking at your stakeholders. I think now more than ever, I'd suggest that because things are as ambiguous as they are, as certain as they are, you actually have to spend more time. I think our natural inclination is to go inwards, and I think we actually have to spend more time looking outwards because many of the things that we're struggling with, other companies are struggling with it as well. At Communitech, we really see a cross-section of organizations, small, medium, large, it's like startup, scale-ups, and enterprise-wide organizations, academia, private public sector. They're all dealing with a lot of the same things. And I think the pace of change that we're dealing with right now is actually surpassed our ability to deal with it on our own as an organization. And I think you need to look to find different ways to work with other organizations, just to share best practices, understand how other organizations are working on particular things, but B, look at the opportunity to collaborate and co-create some solutions. To give you an example, in our community and in communities across Ontario, our Main Street companies are really struggling right now. They don't necessarily have an e-commerce platform. They may not have a digital marketing presence. So Communitech's been working with some of our other innovation hubs in the city of Toronto, and we've been collaborating with Shopify to bring together solutions to actually help these Main Street companies build an e-commerce platform, build a digital marketing platform, and the resources that we're using are actually students. So these are co-op students that don't have placements, and we're working with the universities to actually bring those students in as almost like SWAT teams to help these Main Street companies set up a Shopify site and set up an online presence. So I think, we need to think about how we look at some of the problems that we're facing and how we go about working with other partners within the ecosystem as leaders to really drive things forward.
And co-creating is certainly going to be continuing to take up on the curve. I'd like to turn it over to Kurt. Kurt, as you reimagine the full reopening of workplaces, what do you see to be the biggest changes?
Thank you, Heather. Yes, it's an interesting question, and as I thought about it, I even looked at the question, the full reopening. So it kind of says, we'll go back to what was, and we closed, and now we'll reopen, and that's it. The way we go, and it's not that straightforward. And I think we know that, but we haven't internalized it yet. And I think that's something that's going to be very key, is to internalize that. I mean, I think this is a hardline event. There's going to be a before and an after, and things have changed, instantaneously, really. So, when I think of that, I think of the biggest changes I think that we'll need to survive and thrive. And I think one of them will have to be a focus on people, the actual human beings who work in a business, who are the business. I mean, an organization is nothing but people. I mean, without people, it isn't anything. So that focus back on people and all the things that we've talked about so far around leadership and development and working together and cooperation, you know, and how do we support that? How do we support people experiencing a once in a lifetime, you know, once in a century global pandemic that abruptly changed everything for them, for their life, for their work? Those are things that are going to be necessary, and we will need to work on in order to really pass through and move forward. You know, I also think that you know, from a more practical perspective, and we've talked about this too, I think we have to focus, you know, away from, you know, bums and seats. That's been how we've all worked. I mean, you know, since, you know, really probably the last 100 years, we you know, get together and we go to a building, we go to a place, and we work there. And I think, to the point Kerry brought up earlier, you know, a lot of businesses are still like that, or larger organizations are like that, but they also have, like my organization, we have folks that cannot work anywhere else. Their jobs are at a site, and how do we support them? How do we interact with them? It's always been, you know, out on the floor, out in the field, walking stores, whatever your, you know, whatever your particular business or organization was. You know, how do we do that now? You know, how that has to change, because we need the flexibility. We need to embrace the flexibility that we found in these last 3 or 4 months, and be able to work in the gray to find what's new. So I think, you know, really from a what the biggest changes will be, what they will need to be, is really a focus around people. You know, and that culture shift away from you know, actually physically being there, and how we can be there and not. I think, to Rashmi's point earlier, we've learned a lot about people that we may never know, we never have known, because we're working in different ways. You know, so leveraging those sorts of learnings and insights. So those are really some of the things that I came away with from the question.
Thank you. Great observations, Kurt. And anybody else have anything else to contribute around this new world of, you know, certainly focusing on the leaders and embracing the flexibility that we found in the culture shift?
Yeah, just building on that, I think great points, Kurt. I think it does draw on us to, I hope it draws on us to think differently about how we engage employees as well, and how we do that more rapidly, because the experience, we're not going to have all the answers in leadership, and a lot of those answers will come from the front line, but a lot of that experience, a lot of that day-to-day, this is how it's actually running on the ground. How do we capture that a little more rapidly and a little more consistently, rather than the typical, I'll speak for ourselves, like, you know, the typical, either the yearly pulse survey, the yearly fuller engagement survey, great. But we're going to need to do something a little bit better in how we figure out what those channels are to feed that input into rapid decision making as well. I think will really change how we're operating. I hope it does anyway.
I just, to dovetail on that, Kerry, the one thing I'm wondering is, when you have an organization where you actually have frontline workers that have to be at work, you know, like in the hospitals and the airports and in construction and all different places, how do you not have haves and have-nots of people working from home? So I think we have to be able to create the benefit of that for the frontline workers, whether it's a reinvestment of the money that would have been spent in real estate into new technology, or like, so there's, I think it can't just be they're working from home and they're not.
Right.
There has to be an overall organizational benefit that the frontline workers see right in front of them as well. So it'll take time to figure out what that is. But I think, you know, Kerry, think about healthcare, and, you know, downtown or certain office buildings cost a lot of money. If that money could be rechanneled into, you know, the clinical side, that would be seen as a great thing. So it takes time, but it's like, you know, the same thing with other organizations too. But I think it can't just be some people get to work from home and some people can't. It has to, as a collective, be a really good thing for the organization.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point, Mary, and I think it has to move away from a safety perspective, because that's really what it is right now. I mean, the fewer people you have loaded into a building, the safer the people that have to be there are. It's going to have to move away from that, because You know, at some point this will end, I would hope, and we will have changed, and we will be working remote more, and buildings will have fewer loads. You know, what is the value to everyone then? To your point, to the people that do still have to physically be in the place, and to the organization overall. It's a good point.
Yeah, I think the people talent conversation is a very interesting one when we talk about reopening. I think you know, I've been calling it the COVID life moment, right? Like I think everybody all had a life moment at the exact same time, and people are taking pause and taking stock about, you know, do I actually really want to work for this employer? Do I like my life? Do I like what I'm, you know, where I'm working, what I'm doing? And I think as businesses open back up, I think right now talent's a bit frozen. I think they're feeling like, well, I don't want to make a move right now because you know, it's uncertain. But at some point in time, as businesses start opening back up, talent's going to start thinking about, they've had that pause, so they're starting to reflect and think about, do I really want to do that hour-and-a-half commute to Toronto back and forth? Do I want to work for this? Does this employer align with my values? Do they, and do I like the boss I'm working for? So I think talent is going to be much more fluid. And I think it's an offensive play and a defensive play for organizations. There's an opportunity for you to tap into talent that you never did before, but there's an opportunity for others who are going to tap into your talent like never before, both from a geographical perspective and from a value perspective. So I think this reopening will be a really, it's an inflection point from a talent movement and a talent attraction and retention perspective. That's kind of what I hear around, you know, in terms of focusing on people. There's an opportunity or a window here.
Good point.
Great observation, Simon. So as we think about this COVID life moment, it's a great segue into maybe our poll at this time. We'd like to ask our audience to participate. And I'm going to ask Shania from our team to just launch the poll. We'd like to take a moment to see if it's on your mind. And as we discuss this on future workplaces, you know, here's some of the most pressing issues, and we'd like to know which ones really resonate with our audience. Just give that a little bit of time. And while that poll is continuing, I'd like to take the opportunity to move to the next question that we have then. And I'd like to turn it over to Rashmi at this time. Rashmi, what are the trends you see emerging in organizational learning as a result of the pandemic?
When we think about the pandemic, you know, creeped in slowly and then spread widely. And it reached a peak and plateaued, and it left organizations in that kind of a situation of what happened yesterday, what's happening now, what's going to happen tomorrow, this wondering. And it reminded me of Alvin Toffler, who, the futurist and philosopher and author, who in his book Future Shock defines future shock as too much change in too little time. Does that resonate with us in our current world? Too much change in too little time? And what that meant for organizations was to start wondering, do we have enough knowledge? So it became about knowledge gathering, making meaning of that knowledge, which was confusing at times, complex, complicated. And at times it was just wondering what to do with this. And then creating your own information based on that knowledge and mobilizing it in your own context became so important. And this, what it did was it enhanced emphasis on safety and flexibility. We've been hearing all our panelists speak about the importance of safety and being flexible. And what you saw was that, you know, organizations went from a reactive mode when it happened suddenly to responsive to being proactive. And that was the journey for organizations over the last 4 months. But questions like, you know, what will workplaces look like? What are plexiglass barriers going to do to social interactions? What are elevator rides? We started learning of PPE, personal protective equipment. So many questions and no easy answers. And that is the puzzle that organizations have to work with. And you found also an increase in collaborative decision-making. I found that was huge, because what it did was that you started thinking about not only decision making by talking to other organizations, which is so valuable. I heard Simon say that, but also valuing what your people and your staff are saying. So having that grassroots, top-down, bottom-up approach of listening to people, because nobody has all the information and answers. So from there, it also became about crowdsourcing ideas and then tapping on the collective wisdom of organizations, government agencies, and groups. The other thing I found was that transformation of existing technologies and the digital workspaces. That became huge because you have to be current ready and future prepared now. And the adoption of virtual work had come so suddenly. We were in the process of starting that virtual work, but it came too suddenly, and it reminded organizations that, work is not a place where you go, but work is what you do. So how do we redefine ourselves? And staff had to do they have access to technology to work from home? How can they work remotely? And I had seen a TED talk about Taiwan's digital minister, Audrey Tang, and she spoke about digital democracy. And that, I wondered what that was. And they speak about digital democracy as using digital tools, digital dashboards, digital apps, and they were able to avert the impact of the virus through communication and actions taken digitally. So that, to me, when we think of digital transformation, is not only having the tools, the new tools, but how we are going to use them. That is so important. So, and when we talk about organizational learning, we were in the past always thinking about how to make our organization better. But now it has become about creating a new identity, because we are doing things in a new way. New ways of doing are emerging, whether it's about structures, operations, interpersonal, people, perspectives. So when I start thinking about organizational learning, I really feel that organizational learning is shifted from just the learning about becoming better to creating a new identity, and how we take and pull the whole team, whole organization to that way of thinking. Because when organizational learning is done well, it creates a learning organization that is ready to learn, unlearn, and relearn, the famous quotes. And that is the reality of today for me.
Thanks so much, Rashmi. It's certainly a really great overview. And when you think about how Kerry started off today as well, telling us it's about the leaders learning, but also them in turn also helping to teach and nurture that learning with others. So thank you for sharing that. Just looking at the poll results here, we ended up receiving, it looks like renewing and nurturing culture and ensuring employee engagement are going to be top priorities, and certainly does resonate with what we've been hearing here today. Just like to ask if there's any other further comments that our panel would like to make regarding Rashmi's comments today before we proceed to the last question we have for Simon.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment. I mean, Rashmi, your comment there, work is not a place you go, but what you do. I think that's very profound. I mean, it's very simple, but very profound to keep in mind, because I think a lot of us, I think that's human nature. Work is, where are you going? I'm going to work. It's a, it's a place. That's a very, it's a huge mind shift, I think, and it's something that's I think important, and certainly thank you for it, because I will keep that in mind and use it. I think it's valuable. So.
I think learning is going to be a differentiator for organizations from an attraction standpoint. I think if you take a pause and you think about how much the world has changed, I think the job loss that we've seen, people are still worried about their roles and their jobs today. I think they're starting to think about, wow, we're operating in a much more digital world than we did ever before. I need to find ways to increase my skills, develop new skills, etc. And I think that organizations who offer that type of learning and those opportunities are going to be able to win and attract talent. And I think that the notion of learning, we often associate it with like going into a classroom, or someone's going to pay for my professional development. I think we have to get our heads out of that and position learning much, which is, hey, you know what, a learning opportunity is for you to go out of your role and actually join this team that's going to develop and problem solve and develop this new service model or this new way of working. And I think we need to talk about that much more as learning opportunities and development opportunities, because I think you know, as you look at especially the younger generation coming in, if they're not learning and they've figured this out, if they realize if they're not learning and they're not growing, they're not going to stay with you. So I think that learning organization piece is a real cultural mindset that we need to embed within the organization itself, as well as promote with the talent that we're working with.
Great points. Yeah. Fully agree. I think who we bring in as leaders in terms of their thinking differently about their adaptability and their ability to think differently about how they develop employees, as Simon is saying, I think makes a lot of sense. Experiential learning, on the job learning, definitely the way of the future. For public sector, don't want to speak for everybody, but I would say limit the limited and ever limiting resource pool means that we won't be able to afford as much in terms of purchasing outside, and we certainly won't be able to develop as much in-house. So we're going to have to be very selective and very precise around what we do spend our resources on in terms of that formal learning, and invest heavily in rotations, swaps, shadowing, projects, and thinking very differently about how we actually choose individuals to participate in those opportunities. The overlay, as Mary mentioned earlier, of the inclusion and equity conversations that are coming in, make that all the more important to ensure that we have very robust, equitable, fair processes for determining who gets access to that learning as we go forward, because it'll be so desirable, but yet have its limits.
And just add to that too, Kerry, I think where we're seeing such high unemployment too, is can we open our minds a little bit to, bringing people in that aren't necessarily traditional to the job and then teaching them is our contribution to kind of our communities around us as well. Because there's a lot of people who are going to need to be reskilled and learn in order, for them to change skill sets in terms of what they might have done before and what we need them to do now. And so I think if we can keep our minds open to, not just showing up in a certain box, but actually people who have learning agility and we can sort of get them in and get them up and trained quickly, we'll have a richer workforce, I think, too.
Excellent points, everyone. Thank you. Simon, our future of work expert, what advice would you give to organizations to future-proof their workplaces?
So I think where I'd start is, and I talked about this before, when we talk about the future of work, I think we often associate the future of work right now with remote work, return to work, etc. And if you actually rewind a little bit in terms of prior to COVID, a lot of what was talked around the future of work was really around changes in three different areas. One is the forces that are changing workforce, the workforce expectation, talent expectations. These are things like changing career expectations, career transitions, mental health challenges. How do we actually understand how talent is changing? That's a whole conversation that we haven't really started to talk about again. We still talk a lot about remote work. The other piece is around how learning is changing. So when I think about the future of work, I really think about workplaces changing, which is the remote work, the physical work, culture, et cetera. But then I think about the workforce and learning. And I think the workforce and learning pieces have been a little bit overshadowed by COVID right now. So when you think about what's happening in those spaces, advice I'd give organizations is, again, you can't do this on your own. These are system-wide and societal challenges that require collaboration across different sectors. So if you think about how learning is changing, yes, you can create a learning and development program yourself, but a lot of what's happening within learning, you probably need to think about how you partner with other providers, the academic system, academic institutions in terms of working together. So my advice to organizations is really around, while near-term focus on, yes, what do we do from a remote work perspective and what do we do from a return to work perspective? I think that COVID isn't enough to get us, it's accelerated aspects of the future of work, particularly around those areas, but don't forget about the fact that there's some very broad conversations we need to have around how talent has a very different expectation of the workplace than they ever did before. In the poll, we talked about culture and engagement. I think you're going to hear a lot more around the focus for organizations on employee experience. If you think about where the conversation was 5 years ago or even 7 years ago around corporate innovation, was all around customer centricity, focusing on creating customer experience. I think you're going to see the same thing happen as it relates to employee experience. We have a ton of data on employees now, right? And we also know that you know, the one size fits all experience for employees doesn't really work, right? Even just within our experience around working from home and COVID and et cetera, everybody has different nuances. We're seeing windows into everybody's lives. And so I think the new focus on talent attraction is going to be around that experience piece. How do you actually take a design thinking approach that you might take to a customer and do the same thing as it relates to your employee base, right? Lots has changed around culture and engagement. Have we taken the step back to actually look at what experience, what personas that are of employees work for us, and have we redesigned our experience to reflect that? There was someone that posted in the Q&A about folks who have been furloughed or laid off. How do we bring them back on board? That's an experience. Onboarding is an experience. So can we take a design thinking approach to redesigning that experience moving forward? So I guess my overall message to you is a couple of things. One is focus on experience. I think that is really around, the future of work is really around experience design. And the second thing is, for many of these solutions, I think you do need to figure out how you actually work with other parts of your ecosystem to do that. At Communitech in Waterloo Region, we've actually brought together 19 different organizations in what we're calling the Future Work Coalition. And these organizations comprise private sector, public sector, academia. So we have all three of our academic partners, University of Waterloo, Laurier, and Conestoga involved. We have our municipality and our cities involved. And then we have our startup, scale up, and enterprise companies like Deloitte, Manulife, Morneau Chappelle are some of the more known names, but the lesser known names are organizations like D2L, Exonify, and Plum. These are all organizations who care about learning, who care about experience design as it relates to employees. And we're trying to find those common areas that we want to focus on, where we can actually work together on those things, where they're not really competitive in nature, right? Like they're actually additive for us to actually collaborate on that. And I think we need to find more opportunities to do those types of things as we tackle the future of work, because the pace of change is just happening so fast that I think it's going to be very challenging for leaders and organizations to do it on their own.
Thank you very much, Simon. Does anyone else have anything further to add with respect to the employee experience and the collaboration elements that Simon has brought forward?
Yeah, I would just, I think second that. You're right. I mean, COVID really kind of knocked the socks off of everything. And so that, the thought process around, employee experience and how that had been starting to change and grow has gotten a little sideways. I don't think anybody's thought about it much, but now obviously, we are. And I think that's key. And I think from a leadership perspective, to go back to, really at the start with Kerry, leaders that understand that experience is important. I mean, it's critical. Having that ability, that capacity to understand the an employee's experience and to design it and to create it as much or as well as you would for a customer is critical. I think, to your point, Simon, going forward. So thank you for sharing it.
We have 5 minutes remaining, and I know we wanted to open up for a Q&A, just so our participants know our panel members are willing to stay on for a few additional minutes past 11. So wondering if we could ask just one closing question. As we listen, learn, and see the inequities in our social system that the protests are spotlighting right now, how can organizations meaningfully respond? And just if any of our panelists would like to comment on this.
I like to say that look at who's your staff, what are your processes, policies, programs, what are they like? Try to analyze and assess by seeking input from everybody, because everybody brings their insight, to identify some gaps. And then pick on only a few, 3 to 5 or whatever number of focus areas that you'll work on, and have an action plan. As a whole team, think about allyship, and not only for a namesake, but going deeper what being an ally means. Also about understanding your own biases and, dismissing stereotypes. And the biggest thing is not when something happens in the world to make it an event, we're going to do something now and then we forget about it. It's on paper, but let it be ongoing.
Totally agree with that. I think from a leadership perspective, listen, 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 actively listen, and create space, not only for safe space for conversations. What we're doing is small spaces, very small groups for people to share lived experience, both during the last few weeks and beyond, in their personal lives, but also how it's impacted in their professional lives, and absolutely act. But I agree with Rashmi. Don't try and boil the ocean here. It's you've got to. It's not because we can't take it all on. It's because in my experience in diversity and equity initiatives over the last 10 or 15 years, we try to do too much and then we do nothing. It becomes flavor of the month, inadvertently or sometimes not. But the more progress we show, I hope the more meaning and the more commitment we're actually demonstrating that we actually hear, and we're committed to making change on a personal level and on an organizational level.
Comments. Thank you, Kerry. Yes, the conversation really is the beginning. It's a journey for sure. So I'd like to invite Dr. Jill Birch from our leadership practice. Jill, you're with us?
I'm here. Good morning, everyone. And it's been a fantastic conversation this morning. Thanks to you, everybody, for your great contributions. And we do have a couple of questions. We've asked our panelists to stay on for a few more minutes after the 11 o'clock, so we'll hope you'll stay with us. Got a great question here about risk. And I thought this was a very interesting one because with all of the issues that we're dealing with reopening, with re-strategizing, we now have to think about the level of risk that we're asking ourselves to take on as leaders, our employees to take on as they re-enter. And so the question really frames around, how do we help level set a risk agenda as people re-enter the workplace? And how do we start communicating about what the elements of that risk are? And then in what ways do we start thinking about commitment and accountability around risk, which is always a tricky one as we ask people to do things and ask them to be accountable in a very different kind of way. So just wondering, in any of your experiences, if you've encountered, some discussions, or you're maybe in the formation right now of some policies or some ways that you're going to welcome people back.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yep.
With respect to risk, I think, the risk has to be broken down into a lot of different components. And if I think about maybe sort of the people side of risk is like, leadership and talent risk and health and safety risk as being really, really big ones. I think the word you use, Jill, is accountable. And I think that we as leaders have to be absolutely on in terms of creating the most safe environment possible for our people to be coming back to. And I also think you're going to deal with people whose risk tolerance are different.
Yeah.
And so somebody had said one size doesn't fit all. It's true. Like my two children's risk tolerance are very different. And so I think it's what you said. It's like, listen and really, really try to create a safe environment, both psychologically safe, physically safe. And maybe part of it is pacing people back at a scale that is comfortable as much as possible. I know that there's been talk about what if people won't come back. It's a whole other legal kind of issue. But I think if we as leaders absolutely are accountable to do the very best we can for a physically and psychologically safe environment, and then pay attention to our people, we're addressing the risk, I think, the best way that we can. And again, it will evolve. It'll evolve. If we get a second wave of COVID, we're going to have to start over again. So I think we just have to remain accountable and pay attention to our people.
No, it's really well said, Mary. And I think part of it too is just being able to meet people where they are. Part of the challenge we have is that I think one of the big themes that's come out of our conversation this morning is just everybody's at a different place. And as a leader, there is no sort of monolithic, entry point anymore. And we have to understand that certain people are going to be far more concerned about safety and risk, especially perhaps if you've got, compromised employees, or they're living. I think the ultimate test is going to be people that are living with compromised people. And they're concerned about going back into the work and maybe affecting a loved one, which is going to be a big one. And everybody's, going to have to collect information. And I think, I think to Rashmi's point is just this whole issue of understanding what is the background of your employees, and then how do we begin to formulate. We've got a question here that's come in for on a focus of how leaders adapt. And so what advice do you have, to employees? And, we've talked about the leader trying to help people come back in. So if I'm an employee right now and, I put on that experiential hat, and I thought that was an excellent point that was raised about the experience tracking journey. We've been very focused on, what's happening with our customers and our patients and our students, depending on where you work. The issue now is that I'm an employee and I'm coming back in. What kinds of things can we start thinking about to really help, from the employee framework? And maybe there's some things that you're now doing that you could share with some of our audience about, ways that you are gauging the employee welcome back.
I think this kind of goes to the first question around risk and those sorts of things. And I mean, I think as we've talked a little bit here about, and Simon, I think, has brought it up, and others have, about leveraging your ecosystem. I think that we can all learn and benefit from businesses or entities that are still open, that had to run, that had to have people on site during this. And I've noticed that in a couple of different networking groups that I'm in. We've been running the whole time. Kerry, you've been running the whole time, and so for us, we've already been through that. We spent, weeks and months getting to where, we are comfortable. We've talked to employees. We've built all that. So I think, if you're a purely office-based business or entity where all of your employees are in an office, I think it behooves everyone to reach out within your network to talk to people who have been running the whole time. What did you do? How did you do it? How did you interface with your employees when they had to be there? Because there's lots of learning there, and I think it can be done. And even I was thinking about this from an EHS perspective. I've always worked in retail or manufacturing environments where environmental health and safety has been critical. Our employees can get killed if things go wrong, and that doesn't necessarily happen in an office. So that kind of concept from an office worker is different. And so, again, I think leveraging the network of people that have a different set of skills around safety and communication and those sorts of things, and risk, is critical, because there are lots of people that know how to do this. And I think, they can bring good experience to bear and help other people get more comfortable with talking about risk and how we do things and processes and those things to kind of mitigate risk and help people feel more comfortable when they are coming back. So.
Right. Well, I think it's a really interesting point you've raised there, Kurt, because it's almost like a re-entry process. I think Heather had used the word yesterday, reboarding. Which I thought was an interesting concept where, people maybe have been away from the office for 4 months and now we need to reboard them. And when we think about, the power of getting together digitally like we are today, and then welcoming people back into maybe small conversation circles, maybe that's a way that we begin to find community again, to reestablish our norms and talk about our concerns and our risks and introducing things like that. We've got a great question here, and I think it's one that you probably all of you are pretty much, feeling sad about, is that there's a lot of employees, depending on your sector, you may not be able to welcome back. Maybe their job is gone. And maybe you've had to make some very, very tough decisions over the last few months. The question from this particular person is, what advice would you give to people who have been affected from an employment perspective in COVID? If you, maybe aren't going to be welcomed back into your workplace and you're sitting there in a situation that you just wouldn't have dreamed of in January. Is there any advice that any of you would have to help people get back on their feet, to regain their confidence? We've talked a lot about reskilling and the experience and talent and those kinds of things. Is there any help or advice that you might be able to give those folks who are, or perhaps to Simon's, because they don't like their boss, they've realized they don't like their situation, and all of a sudden they want a new world, and they too will be experiencing a new work environment. Any thoughts on how somebody would maybe recalibrate their skills and present them out there into the new post-COVID world?
I guess. Go ahead.
Just briefly, Kurt. One thing, I don't know if this totally answers your question, Jill, but one thing I'm thinking is, as us in organizations and trying to have some social responsibility to our communities, is do we start to try and partner? If we are organizations that are hiring, do we try to partner with organizations that are downsizing, in a way to sort of look at how could we cultivate skills and trades for people to relearn, and as kind of as a community, as opposed to it being a competition of businesses. But as we can be some glue that, I recall some years ago when GM was downsizing, and I was in retail at the time, and it was so hard for us to find good people to train up through to management. So it was just a concept of, how can we sort of come together to help our community of workers as opposed to our own people. That would just be a thought.
Yeah, it's a great thought. Any other insights on that one from any of our panel?
So my comment is maybe less about the person that's been displaced or laid off. One of the interesting things I've seen organizations do in the tech sector to help people who have been laid off is they've been creating this alumni concept.
Oh,
so
nice.
the idea would be, so they've had to let people go because of the circumstance and situation, and they're not probably going to be able to hire them back. But they're not letting go people that were performance issues or anything like that. So what the concept they're piloting is really an alumni concept. So think about when you go to a university and you're an alumni, they treat you like you're still part of the family, right? And they bring you back for gatherings. They bring you back, in this case, obviously virtual gatherings. They keep you up to date as to what's going on within the organization. So I've seen a few companies actually consider piloting or are piloting this type of a concept. Deloitte's been doing it for a while, but it's an interesting concept because it keeps the person or the individual close to that organization. And they're actually become a bit of a brand ambassador for them. So if you think about, being laid off, that usually doesn't have a great connotation to it, but if someone treats you like an alumni, it's a bit of a different way of looking at it. And there's a couple of outcomes. One is they're a brand ambassador. Number two, they still stay connected to talent because at some point in time, maybe they're rehiring again and they want to bring the talent back. And three, talking about working with your ecosystem or thinking more from an innovation perspective, even if they go work somewhere else, staying in contact with that person to think about, hey, you know, we're thinking about these things strategically, or products, or whatever it is. Keeping that connection. They may have a brand new experience, but they understand your business. They can give you advice, and they can give you maybe access to, depending on where they go, parts of your value chain, insights into your value chain that you didn't have before. So that might be, again, not directly at the individual who's been displaced, but for organizations to treat this as a bit of a, it sounds callous, but an opportunity for you to actually think of it more from an alumni perspective, as opposed to being helpless and having to lay someone off and just leaving them to their own devices.
I think that's fantastic. Kerry, did you have a point there?
No, I was just going to say, excellent point. I love when Simon focused in on the brand ambassador piece, and don't discount that particular employee's network themselves, because they have their own ecosystem. And I think it's just a brilliant point. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, one other thought that I also had as Simon, you were talking, was the power of your association. So all of you have powerful, powerful associations, and I've been following the studies that have been done, you know, and the associations are really struggling right now. I don't know if you've been in contact with your, you know, whatever professional groups that you're allied with, and following that story. And so an opportunity to strengthen the association, as well as to help you network and find out what are these new skills that are going to be required in the future. You know, reach out, you know, to your professional association, reach out to, I know in the digital world, there's all kinds of incredible networks. Those of you who have been dialing into Collision, and I'm probably keeping Simon away from his appointment with Collision today, will know that, that there's an incredible network, 32,000 people. Are online right now. And so taking advantage of those things, and certainly it's something that we've been talking about at Phelps, is how do we build the community of practice around all these contacts that we have that are joining our webinars, that are reaching out to us. And so I think at this moment, there's a higher level of altruism. You know, we've always, you know, done well by doing good. We know that in our heart. And I think what COVID has done is really shown us that there's other things that we need to be more engaged in, you know, just not from an employee perspective, but from a leadership perspective. So we're just closing in now at about 11:12. I think we're going to be wrapping up. And thank you everyone for joining us. We've had an incredibly energized conversation. I've just got a couple of quick points that overview the themes that came out, and then I'm going to turn it over to Heather to sign off. But a couple of the key themes that came out today that I thought were very interesting is the tension between the digital and the analog world. The fact that we've got so many people now working at home, we've got so many people that are, you know, in that front line of care, and toggling that balance between how we actually meet in the middle, how we begin to navigate as leaders. I think that's going to be an incredibly important skill as we move forward. Picking up on Rashmi's point about work is that, you know, a place to go is not a place to go anymore. It's what you do. And, you know, for many people who are working in highly structured organizations, creating a change around that concept is not going to be that easy. If people are used to a certain thing, being very deft around how you communicate, the kinds of ways that you get people to have that self-revelatory experience, there is a different way to work and a different way to be. And that kind of ties into the next one, which all of you hit on, which is the experiential. I think I'm going to add an E to your E, and I'm also going to say it's going to be the time of experiential and experimental. I think these are the moments where we need to try new things. And if anybody has, you know, been working in COVID right now, you have done things you've probably never done before. You might not ever do them again, but you have tried things you probably had never, ever done. And so thinking about, you know, and it would be interesting to hear what Rashmi's comments are, you know, later on, maybe this is another webinar we do, but how do you begin as an organization to create safe sandboxes for experimenting? We talked a lot about the external and the partnering. And this is key. Every piece of research that I've certainly seen of COVID leadership behavior indicates that successful leaders are out. They're not just looking inside their organization, they're looking everywhere. They're trying to learn what other people are doing. They're assessing and synthesizing that. They're bringing it in, again, trying a little experiment to see if it works, and then sharing that. And the last thing I thought was super important was this whole notion of what is talent? And how do I begin to develop my talent And you know, the themes that are coming out, and this is a challenging one, is the self-responsibility for talent. There have been, you know, great programs throughout all of our organizations that give formal and informal mentorship. Maybe if you're lucky, you get sent off to a program, and that's going to be a long time away from now, where you'll be sent away to develop your skills and strategy or whatever it may be. And the question now begins, how do we help change the culture in our organization and go back? You know, remember when the year 2000, everybody talked about the learning organization. That was a big, huge theme. And then it got buried in customer experience and branding and digital. And now maybe there's a resurgence of what it means to create rebirth, you know, this learning organization that we're all working with. So the points that everyone raised was just incredible. And I'd say the last line is, it is a new level of learning, a new level of being. And there is, you know, a lot of dark shadows around COVID, but there are things that we have learned, and we will be stronger. And so together we're stronger, and thank you so much for your brilliant insights. And I'm going to turn it over to Heather to wish us well.
Thanks so much, Jill. And wow, where did this past hour and 15 minutes go? Thank you to our panelists for sharing such great insights today. We will be sending this link for the presentation out, so we certainly ask that if you found it useful, pass it along to your colleagues. And thanks again to everyone for participating. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Our panelists can now sign off. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.